What is an extremely dark, creepy true story that most people don't know about? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Cameron used the grant money to convert the old horse stables behind the hospital into isolation boxes. He also elaborately renovated the basement so that it contained a room he called the isolation chamber. He soundproofed the room, piped in white noise, turned off the lights and put dark goggles and rubber eardrums on each patient, as well as cardboard tubing on the hands and arms, preventing him from touching his body, thus interfering with his self-image, as Cameron put it in a 1956 paper. But, where Heb's students fled less intense sensory deprivation after only a couple of days, Cameron kept his patients in 4 weeks, with one of them trapped in the isolation box for 35 days. Cameron further starved his patients' senses in the so-called sleep room, where they were kept in drug-induced reverie for 20 to 22 hours a day, turned by nurses every 2 hours to prevent bed sores and wakened only for meals and to go to the toilet. Patients were kept in this state for 15 to 30 days, though Cameron reported that some patients have been treated up to 65 days of continuous sleep. Hospital staffers were instructed not to allow patients to talk and not to give out any information about how long they would have to spend in the room. To make sure no one successfully escaped from this nightmare, Cameron gave one group of patients small doses of the drug curare, which induces paralysis, making them literal prisoners in their own bodies. Realizing that some patients were keeping track of time of day based on their meals, Cameron ordered the kitchen to mix it all up, changing mealtimes and serving soup for breakfast and porridge for dinner. By varying these intervals and by changing the menu from the expected time, we were able to break up this structuring, Cameron reported with satisfaction. Even so, he discovered that despite his best efforts, one patient had maintained a connection with the outside world by noting the faint rumble of a plane that flew over the hospital every morning at 9. The Shock Doctrine, pp. 35-36. Gilles de Rais. He was a contemporary of Joan of Arc who tortured and killed children, oftentimes in black magic rituals. Greater than in his own confession, Gilles testified that, when the said children were dead, he kissed them and those who had the most handsome limbs and heads he held up to admire them, and had their bodies cruelly cut open and took delight at the sight of their inner organs. And very often when the children were dying he sat on their stomachs and took pleasure in seeing them die and laughed. That's far from the most despicable act de Rais was involved with. The fact that 3 sailors were trapped alive in the submarine wreckage of the USS West Virginia after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They survived for 16 days, kept a calendar, and constantly knocked on the ship's hull in an effort to alert rescuers. However, they were also sitting on tons of sunken live ammunition, and there was no adequate technology to rescue them. Thus, those above ground simply had to listen to a haunting banging noise for 16 days. The story was only recently made public. The unsolved murders at Hinterkaifeck. In a small German town on March 31 of 1922, 6 inhabitants of a farm were individually lured into their barn and killed with a mattock, or pickaxe. Greater than the autopsy also showed that the younger Kazilia had been alive for several hours after the assault. Lying in the straw, next to the bodies of her grandparents and her mother, she had torn her hair out in tufts. Greater than a few days prior to the crime, farmer Andreas Gruber told neighbors about discovering footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm, but none leading back. He also spoke about hearing footsteps in the attic and finding an unfamiliar newspaper on the farm. Furthermore, the house keys went missing several days before the murders, but none of this was reported to the police. Greater than 6 months earlier, the previous maid had left the farm, claiming that it was haunted. The new maid, Maria Baumgardner, arrived on the farm on the 31st of March, only a few hours before her death. It is believed that the killers had lived in their attic for days, if not longer, before committing the crimes. After the crime had been committed, greater than it is believed that the perpetrators remained at the farm for several days. Someone had fed the cattle and eaten food in the kitchen. The neighbors had also seen smoke from the chimney during the weekend. Also, possibly the most disturbing thing I've ever read. The murder of Junko Furuta. I'm not going to summarize that one. You just have to read it. No one knows about Cayetano Santos Godinho, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, serial killers ever. Greater than Cayetano Santos Godinho, October 31, 1896 to November 15, 1944. Also known as Petiso Orejudo, Big-Eared Midget, was an Argentinian serial killer who terrorized Buenos Aires at the age of 16. In the early 20th century, he was responsible for the murder of 4 children, the attempted murder of another 7 children, and the arson of 7 buildings. A little bit about his family, who were Italian immigrants. Greater than Godino was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, one of 8 boys. His father and mother, Fiore Godino and Lucia Ruffo, were alcoholics and abusive. Godino's father contracted syphilis before Godino was born, causing Godino to experience serious childhood health problems. Again, he was a very young boy when he committed his first crimes. Here are some of them. Note the ages of his victims. This one, when he was only 7 years old. Greater than when he was 7 years old, Godino beat 2-year-old Miguel de Pauli and threw him into a ditch. A nearby official saw this and led the children to the police station, where their mothers picked them up a few hours later. At the age of 8. Greater than a year later, Godino beat 18-month-old Anna Neri, a child in his neighborhood, with a rock. A police officer intervened, and Godino was released from jail due to his young age. At 16. Greater than on January 17, 1912, Godino set fire to a warehouse on Corrientes Street. When he was arrested, he told police, "I like to see firemen working. It's nice to see how they fall into the fire." And probably one of the most sadistic ones, also at the age of 16. Greater than on December 3, 1912, Godino saw 3-year-old Gesualdo Giordano playing outside his house and offered to buy the boy some sweets to convince him to go with him. Providing a few sweets then offering more, Godino took Giordano to a country house. When they were inside, he threw him to floor and unsuccessfully tried to choke him with his belt. Then he cut his belt and tied his hands and legs. He started beating him and considered hammering his head. He left the house looking for a nail and saw Giordano's father, to whom he said he did not know where the child was. He then re-entered the house with the nail. He hammered it into the side of Giordano's skull and hid the corpse. The body was found by the father minutes later. At 8 p.m., Godino went to the wake and touched the skull where he had fixed the nail. At 5:30 a.m. on December 4, 1912, he was arrested by police, confessing his crimes. There's even a movie about him. It's pretty good, I might add. I guess nobody else will tell of the San Fernando massacres. I consider it to be the worst thing a person with a family could possibly endure. Basically, the cartel abducted several buses full of people, forced the men to fight to the death. The winners were sent on suicide missions into rival cartel territory. The women were beaten and raped then killed. The children were also beaten and raped. The infants were dissolved in acid, but not submerged. The sick fucks let the kids scream for a while. Then they took away the children from their mothers, and shot the rest of the bus passengers. The women were taken to a warehouse where many other women were held captive. Inside a dark room, the women were reportedly raped and beaten, while the one heard the screams of the women and of the kids being put in acid. This wasn't an isolated incident. It happened often enough that the bus line refused to go into San Fernando, until the situation was resolved. The murder of James Bulger. Greater than James Patrick Bulger, the 16th of March 1990 to 12 February 1993, was a boy from Kirkby, England, who was murdered on the 12th of February 1993, at the age of 2. He was abducted, tortured and murdered by 2 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson, born the 23rd of August 1982, and John Venables, born the 13th of August 1982. Here's a picture of them taking the kid. Here's a picture of the kids that did it. Court stated that Bulger's foreskin had been forcibly retracted. The lead masks case. In 1966 in Brazil, a boy flying a kite found 2 dead guys wearing lead masks. They wore raincoats and had a bottle of water with them, as well as notebook saying, 1630 be at the agreed place 1830 take capsules after effect metals wait for mask sign. The capsules could have been, and probably were, poison, but the bodies were incorrectly stored and became contaminated. All we know about the men was that they went into a shop and bought raincoats and the bottle of water at a shop and went straight to the hill. Nobody knows where they got the tablets or what they expected to happen. The case remains unsolved 47 years later. There is a phenomena on the coast of North Carolina called Seneca guns. There are sudden booms that feel like a sonic boom or an earthquake, but time and time again, there are no aircraft in the area, nor is any seismic activity recorded. I just discovered this while I was there last week when I was awoken by the house rattling, like someone had bumped the pylons with their car. When no cause could be found, I went to the internet to look for an earthquake off NC, and that is when I found out about the Seneca guns. The Byford Dolphin Diving Bell Incident. An explosive decompression underwater kills 5 divers. From the wiki. Greater than diver 4, being exposed to the highest pressure gradient, violently exploded due to the rapid and massive expansion of internal gases. All of his thoracic and abdominal organs, and even his thoracic spine were ejected, as were all of his limbs. Greater than simultaneously, his remains were expelled through the narrow trunk opening left by the jammed chamber door, less than 60 centimeters, 24 in diameter. Fragments of his body were found scattered about the rig. One part was even found lying on the rig's derrick, 10 meters, 30 feet, directly above the chambers. Gloomy Sunday. A song by Rezo Saris caused lots of suicide. It is often referred to as the Hungarian suicide song. It starts in 1933 when Hungarian composer Rezo Saris broke up with his girlfriend on a Sunday. In utter despair he pens, Gloomy Sunday. The first publisher rejects his song as too depressing. The second commits suicide. But the third sees the potential and publishes, Gloomy Sunday, throughout Europe. People start dying immediately. In Berlin, a man shot himself after telling relatives he couldn't get that damn song out of his head. In Rome, an errand boy heard a beggar humming the tune, got off his bike, gave the beggar all his money and jumped from the nearest bridge. In 1 year alone in Hungary 17 suicides were found with notes quoting the Gloomy Sunday lyrics. Of course, skeptics dismiss these claims as anecdotal, quoting the rather strange fact that Hungary was so well known for its high suicide rate that 17 people found dead in 1 year clutching the lyrics to a song was par for the course. In 1936 the song reached New York and was marketed as the Hungarian suicide song. Within a week a typist had gassed herself, requesting Gloomy Sunday be played at her funeral. As the death toll mounted, a third verse was added to the song. A happy verse that was intended to counter the depressive urges of the first two. A verse that said, "Wait, it was all a dream, she's not dead, there's no reason to commit suicide and, look, the sun's coming out." It didn't work. The power of Gloomy Sunday wasn't confined to the lyrics. It was the dirge-like melody. As the BBC found out when they banned Gloomy Sunday, but allowed an instrumental version. A recording was made and released on a 78. Which caused panic in North London when a woman kept playing the record over and over. Neighbors banged on her doors, the police were called, the door forced open and she was found dead inside, of an overdose. With the BBC, the US and France all banned the song. Here's the link. I've posted this in a similar thread before, but here goes. Most people think that Newtown or Virginia Tech was the worst incident of mass murder at a US school. They're wrong. Andrew Kyo's neighbors described him as an intelligent, but impatient man. More quietly they spoke of how he had beaten one of his horses to death in a fit of rage when it failed to meet his expectations. His reputation for thriftiness earned him the role of treasurer of the school board in Bath, Michigan, but the other members soon found him difficult to work with. By 1926, his wife became ill with chronic tuberculosis. The cost of her treatments had put a strain on the couple's finances, but Kyo blamed the school superintendent. Around the same time, he ran for the position of town clerk, which he had been temporarily filling, but was soundly defeated. He took this as a personal rejection by the people of Bath, and began to make strange remarks, telling a bus driver he was delivering a paycheck to, "My boy, you want to take good care of that check as it is probably the last check you will ever get," or warning a teacher that if she wanted a picnic she would better have it at once. On the morning May 18, 1927, Kyo set off firebombs that he had set across his property. He then packed his truck full of pyritol, a repurposed World War I incendiary explosive, and dynamite, and drove into town, telling firefighters arriving at the scene, "Boys, you're my friends. You better get out of here. You better head down to the school." 15 minutes after classes began at the Bath Consolidated School, an alarm clock went off, detonating a stockpile of explosives that Kyo had hidden there in the basement over the course of months, using his position as a school handyman. The initial blast killed 38 people, collapsed the entire north wing of the school, trapping more in the rubble. A half an hour later, as townspeople had flocked to the school to try and rescue students and teachers from the wreckage, Kyo pulled up. When he saw the superintendent there, he waved him over, confessed to the bombing. Kyo then said, "I'll take you with me," and fired the rifle he was carrying into the back seat, detonating the explosives there, and killing 7 more people including himself. Investigators found several things when they examined his farm later. He had girdled all his trees to kill them, cut all his fences, and wired the legs of his horses together so he couldn't be rescued from the fire. They found his wife, beaten to death. They found a sign with the words, "Criminals are made, not born," stenciled on it and tied to the fence. And finally, they found unused farm equipment in his barn that, if he had sold it, would have relieved his financial burden. You can read more about the Bath School disaster here. Peter Dupas was a pretty fucked up guy. His criminal signature was to remove women's breasts. He raped a mother with the threat to kill her child, and he had no remorse for his crimes. He was let out of prison multiple times even though he kept reoffending. Also, fuck Reddit. It's a complete cesspool of censorship and bias. I was a 10-year user permanently banned for not following groupthink. You are not allowed to have your own opinions. The Snowtown murders, greater than also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, were a series of homicides that took place in South Australia between August 1992 and May 1999. The crimes were uncovered on the 20th of May 1999, when the remains of 8 victims were found in barrels of acid in a rented former bank building. The building was littered with tools used by the killers to torture and murder their victims, including knives, a bloodstained saw, double-barreled shotgun, coils of rope, rolls of tape, rubber gloves, cloths, and a Variac metallurgy tool that the killers used to administer electric shocks to the genitals and other sensitive parts of the victim's body. I'm late on this, but in my hometown in 2006, a 10-year-old girl was kidnapped. There was a huge search that went on to only find that her apartment upstairs neighbor had taken her. He raped her both alive and dead and then cut her into pieces and soaked her in meat tenderizer. He also cut her head about halfway through at the mouth. She was found in plastic tubs in meat tenderizer. He planned on eating her. Creepy to me because it happened 3 blocks from my house and I was one of the last people to see her alive. Story there is I saw her at the outside the library shortly before she walked home and was abducted. Her name was Jamie Rose Boleyn, I think. This one is just from what my mom told me. I was too little to remember or understand what was happening, so some info might be off. The town I live in now has a creepy story as well. In the early 1990s, a little boy went missing. They looked everywhere for his body and finally found it in a trash bag hidden in a frisbee golf course. He was still alive. He was raped and his genitals were mutilated, but the worst part is that his kidnapper cut the little boy's eyelids off so that he had to watch. The boy said that the man lured him to the park by saying that the kidnapper lost his dog and asked the kid to help find him. The man was never found and the boy is still alive today. TLDR. I live in a really fucked up place.